There's a moment, and I've seen it maybe a dozen times in my career, where everything in a room goes completely still. Not quiet still, like the air itself decides it doesn't want to move anymore, like sound gets nervous. I saw that moment the day Lady Thessalvin Oral Voss spat on Sergeant Marcus Hale. And I saw what happened next. I need you to understand something before I tell you this story. I was there, standing maybe 40 feet away, holding a data pad I wasn't reading, pretending to review logistics for the third conclave reception. I had a clear sightline. I didn't miss a single second of what happened, and I've thought about it almost every day since. This is not a rumor. This is not something somebody told somebody who told me. I was there. The Meridian Drift Station isn't on any civilian map. You won't find it in the Galactic Commerce Registry, not under that name anyway. If you search hard enough in the old Alliance directories, the ones from before the Unification Accords, you'll find it listed as Waypoint 7 now, which tells you basically nothing about what it actually is. What it actually is a miracle of construction and bad decisions. Built across 2 decades by 4 different species, each of whom had a completely different idea of what a neutral diplomatic hub was supposed to look like. The station sits at the gravitational junction point between the Voss Reach territories and the outer boundaries of human-controlled space. It's shaped roughly like a wheel that got stepped on and then partially repaired by someone who didn't have the original blueprint. 3 of the spokes are Voss architectural style, smooth, curved, biologically resonant materials that shift slightly in color depending on ambient temperature. 2 spokes are human construction, angular, efficient, covered in conduit runs and exposed junction boxes that the Voss delegates always look at like they're personally offended. 1 spoke was built by the Drithari, who are architects the way sharks are swimmers. They don't think about it, they just are it. And the result is a 600-meter corridor that somehow makes you feel small and safe at the exact same time. The central hub where everything connects is called the consensus ring. That's where the reception was being held. I'd been stationed on Meridian Drift for 11 months at that point, working as a junior attaché for the Human Diplomatic Corps. My actual job was mostly making sure the translation matrices were calibrated correctly and that the right food substitutes were available for whichever species happened to be visiting. You'd be surprised how many interstellar crises have been narrowly avoided, because someone remembered that Voss biochemistry processes synthetic protein differently than natural protein, and made sure the catering reflected that. Small things, I dealt in small things, which is probably why nobody noticed me standing there when the big thing happened. The morning of the reception started the way most mornings on Meridian Drift started, with the low harmonic hum of the station's gravity generators cycling through their calibration sequence, a sound so constant that you only noticed it when it stopped. The artificial lighting in the residential corridors shifted from sleep cycle amber to waking cycle white at 600 station time, and the first transports from the Voss delegation quarters would begin their short trip down the connector tube to the consensus ring around 7:30. I was up at 5:30, not because I had to be, because I couldn't sleep. Something about the atmosphere on the station in the days leading up to the third conclave had been different, tighter, like the station itself was holding its breath. The Voss delegation this cycle was larger than usual, 14 officials instead of the customary 8, and 3 of them held titles that our intelligence briefings flagged as significant. Not dangerous, exactly, but significant. The kind of significant that makes the people above you in the organizational chart start sending more messages and attending more meetings with their doors closed. Lady Thessalvin Oral Voss was the highest-ranking member of the delegation. That name, Oral Voss, the second part isn't a family name the way humans use family names. In Voss noble structure, the suffix denotes lineage recognition by the ruling house. It meant she wasn't just aristocracy. She was recognized aristocracy, confirmed, validated, and publicly acknowledged by the House of Voss itself. I'd read her briefing file 3 times. She was, by every account, one of the most formidable political minds the Voss had produced in 2 generations. She negotiated the Paladine trade revision almost single-handedly. She'd brokered the ceasefire in the Drellin border skirmishes when 3 other senior diplomats had failed. She was brilliant, patient, and apparently completely incapable of tolerating what she considered to be incompetence. The file didn't say that last part outright, but it was there between the lines in the diplomatic language. Phrases like high standards of professional conduct and expects operational precision from all support staff. The kind of phrases that, in a diplomatic briefing, mean this person has made people cry and considers it appropriate. She was also, according to supplementary notes added by Commander Yevaristan, our senior security coordinator, someone who had a complicated history with human personnel. Not violent, not openly hostile, but complicated. The Voss had a cultural framework around service roles that was genuinely difficult to translate. In their social structure, a protection detail, bodyguards, occupied a position that was simultaneously one of deep practical trust and one of very low social standing. You trusted your guard with your life. You did not, under any circumstances, treat your guard as a social equal. The guard existed in your sphere, but not of it. Most Voss nobles navigated this by simply ignoring their guards, pretending they weren't there unless they were needed. Some navigated it less gracefully. The note in the file said Lady Thesavin was, quote, occasionally expressive regarding protection personnel. I remember thinking that was an interesting way to put it. Sergeant Marcus Hale had been assigned to the Voss delegation detail 4 days before the reception. I want to take a moment here and describe him properly, because it matters. It matters for the story, and it matters because I think people deserve to know who he was before they know what happened to him. Marcus Hale was 37 years old. He'd served with the Joint Protection Corps, the human organization that provides security for multi-species diplomatic functions, for 12 years. Before that, 2 tours with the Outer Systems Defense Force, which is the kind of service history that basically tells you a person spent years in situations with no good options and had to find the least bad option over and over again until it became instinct. He was a big man, not enormous, not the kind of big that makes people take a step back automatically, but the kind of big that you noticed once you'd been near him for a few minutes, the kind of big that comes from years of physical work, not performance. His hair was dark going gray at the temples, cut short the way people keep their hair when they can't be bothered with it. His face had the kind of stillness to it that you see in people who have learned to control their reactions, because their reactions have consequences. I'd spoken to him twice before the reception. Once in the logistics briefing, once in the corridor outside the translation suite when we both ended up reaching for the same coffee dispenser and had a brief, slightly awkward negotiation over who was going to use it first. He'd been formal in the briefing. In the corridor, he'd been quietly amused, and he gestured for me to go ahead with the kind of small courtesy that some people just carry naturally. That was it, 2 conversations. But I'd watched him work. You can learn a lot about a person by watching them in their professional environment without them knowing you're watching. Not in a creepy way, in the way that all of us in diplomatic support roles learn to watch, because our job is to understand the shape of a room, who's comfortable, who's not, where the friction points are before they become friction. Marcus Hale moved through a room the way people move when they've memorized it. Not rigid, not robotic. Fluid almost. He knew where every exit was without looking at them. He tracked every person who entered his peripheral field without turning his head. And he did all of this while appearing, to the casual observer, to simply be standing there. He was very good at his job. He was also, as I would learn later from the security team's informal debriefs, patient to a degree that some of his colleagues found almost supernatural. There's a particular kind of patience that comes from discipline, and then there's a kind of patience that comes from genuine steadiness, a deep, internal center that doesn't easily tip. The people who'd worked with Marcus longest said he had the second kind. They also said, and this matters, that he was completely aware of what the Voss delegation assignment meant. He'd been briefed on the cultural framework. He knew what occasionally expressive regarding protection personnel likely translated to in practice. He'd accepted the assignment anyway. When someone asked him why, one of the younger security officers, apparently not someone with great filter, he just said, "Somebody has to." The morning of the reception, the consensus ring was transformed. I say transformed, but what I mean is that the regular conference space, with its modular furniture and its practical lighting and its perpetual faint smell of recirculated air, had been overlaid with several layers of aesthetic effort by about a dozen different support staff working through the night. The Voss brought their own environmental preferences, That's standard for high-ranking delegations. Atmospheric adjusters that shifted the humidity slightly, ambient light modulators that added a soft spectrum of color to the overhead panels. Colors that fell partly outside human visual range. So they looked, to my eyes, like a very pleasant but hard-to-name shade between violet and something that doesn't have a word in any human language. Scent dispersers that released something organic and clean, like rain that's never fallen on actual soil. It was beautiful, honestly. I always thought it was beautiful, even when the setup process was exhausting. The Voss delegation arrived at 8:42, about 12 minutes behind schedule. This is worth noting only because the lateness was not an accident. Lady Thesavin's staff had communicated through the appropriate channels that the lady would be adjusting her arrival time by a brief interval to accommodate a biological calibration requirement. This is Voss diplomatic language for. She needed a few more minutes in the atmospheric adjustment suite to ensure her sensory comfort for the reception. What it meant in practical terms was that everyone in the consensus ring who was supposed to be at their posts at 8:30 was now standing around trying to look professionally composed for an extra 12 minutes while also wondering when to stop standing at attention. Marcus Hale stood at his designated position, 3 meters to the left of the primary reception entrance, the position of the personal protection specialist for the senior diplomatic guest, for those entire 12 minutes without moving anything except his eyes. I watched him from across the room. He didn't shift his weight. He didn't glance at his data pad. He didn't do the thing that most people do when they're waiting, which is to find something to look at that isn't the thing they're waiting for. He just stood there, present and completely still, the way a person stands when they have nothing to prove about standing. When Lady Thesavin Oral Voss entered the consensus ring at 8:42, the room recalibrated around her presence the way rooms recalibrate around certain kinds of people. I've been in diplomatic environments long enough to have seen a fair number of powerful individuals make their entrances, and I can tell you that it's rarely what you expect. Mostly, powerful people enter a room and what happens is that other powerful people notice and the rest of the room follows their cue. The response is social, lateral. It moves through the crowd. Lady Thesavin entered the room and the response was direct. Vertical almost. People didn't look at each other and then look at her. They looked at her. She was tall even by Voss standards. The Voss are, on average, somewhat taller than humans, with a skeletal structure that's slightly elongated in the limbs and the neck, and a cranial formation that's broader across the temples than humans are. Their skin tone can vary wildly from almost white to deep indigo, and Lady Thesavin's was the color of deep water, a dark blue that caught the light of the atmospheric modulators and seemed to hold it. She was wearing the formal robes of her office, which in Voss culture means layered fabrics of increasing opacity, the outermost layer almost translucent, so that you're always seeing the suggestion of what's underneath. Multiple signifiers in the robes, all of which meant something to a Voss audience, none of which I was fully equipped to read. Her hair, if you can call it that, the Voss have head structures that look like hair but are actually sensory filaments, was arranged in a formal configuration that I knew from my briefing indicated active diplomatic status. It meant she was working. This was not social time. She moved through the entrance with her staff arranged around her, and she did not look at Marcus Hale. He stepped into position beside and slightly behind her right shoulder, the standard placement for personal protection. Smooth, no hesitation. She didn't acknowledge him. I noted this. I noted everything that morning, because something in the air had made me pay attention, and I was glad later that I had. The first hour of the reception proceeded normally. Introductions, formal greetings, the exchange of diplomatic acknowledgements in a protocol order that had been rehearsed and approved through 3 rounds of committee review. Lady Thesavin was, professionally, exactly what her file suggested she would be. Precise. Controlled. Every word considered before it was spoken, every gesture carrying weight. She was meeting with Director Emeritus Callan Vaughan, the human side senior representative, and 2 of his senior staff. I was one of the junior people hovering at the edges of this exchange, available if a translation or logistical question came up. Marcus Hale remained at his position throughout. The second hour was when the room expanded. More delegates joining the reception, the informal portion beginning, the careful architecture of structured diplomacy relaxing slightly into something that looked more like a gathering of people but was still, underneath, entirely deliberate. This is the part of these events that's actually hardest. The formal portion has a script. The informal portion requires improvisation within invisible rules. Lady Thessalvin moved through the expanded room with her staff. Marcus moved with her. I was near the atmospheric adjustment console on the eastern wall, checking a reading that one of the Voss environmental specialists had flagged. A minor fluctuation in the humidity dispersal that didn't actually require intervention, but needed to be documented, when I heard the voice change. Not loud, the room was filled with conversation, but there's a pitch that human ears lock onto sometimes, something in the quality of a sound that cuts through ambient noise, and Lady Thessalvin's voice had dropped into that pitch. I looked up. She was standing approximately in the center of the consensus ring, maybe 40 feet from me. Her back was slightly turned. Her staff were arranged in their usual positions. And Marcus Hale was standing just behind her right shoulder, as he had been for 2 hours. She was speaking in Voss. My Voss is functional but not fluent. I can follow a conversation if it's slow and the speaker isn't using formal registers. She was speaking at a normal pace in what sounded like a somewhat formal register, and the words I caught were fragmentary. Positioning, inappropriate. The distance is something I couldn't catch. Standing as though equal. I couldn't hear his response if he gave one. He might have said nothing. Then she turned. Not all the way. A partial turn, the kind that indicates acknowledgement of a presence rather than engagement with it. And she looked at him. I've tried in the months since to find the right word for the expression on her face in that moment. Not anger exactly. Not contempt exactly. Something that was in the vicinity of both, but was, I think, more specific than either. The expression of a person who has encountered something that they find genuinely confusing and have decided, rather than working through the confusion, to simply express their displeasure at the fact of the confusion existing. He looked back at her, completely calm, not blank. I want to be clear that the stillness in his expression was not the absence of something. It was the presence of something else. Control, maybe, or patience. The kind of patience that doesn't need to announce itself. She said something else. 3 words, maybe 4, in Voss. I caught 2, proximity and presumption. And then, with an expression that was almost academic in its deliberateness, she turned her head and spat. I want to try to explain what that meant, because I think if you don't understand the context, you might underestimate the weight of it. In human cultures, spitting at someone is an insult. It's aggressive, it's degrading, and it's generally considered one of the more viscerally offensive things you can do to another person without touching them. Most cultures have this in common. In Voss culture, spitting is something different. For the Voss, the act carries a formalized meaning. It's not random or casual. It's the specific public declaration that a person has been assessed and found to be in violation of their station, that they have, in the social framework of the Voss, overreached, acted above their designated position. The Voss call it Velthrine, which translates roughly as returning a person to their proper place. It's not done lightly. It requires an audience. It requires intent. It's meant to be seen. And it had just been done, in the middle of the 3rd conclave reception, in front of 14 members of the Voss delegation, 6 human diplomatic staff, 2 Drithari observers, and me, to Sergeant Marcus Hale of the Joint Protection Corps. The room went still. That still I described at the beginning. That air deciding it doesn't want to move any more still. I stopped breathing, I think. I know I stopped moving. The datapad in my hands suddenly felt very heavy. Marcus didn't move either. He stood there and he looked at her, and there was a moment, I think it was maybe 3 seconds, but it felt much longer, where the two of them existed in a kind of gravity that had nothing to do with the station's generators. Then he reached up. Slowly, deliberately, not aggressively. Nothing in his motion was aggressive. He reached up with his right hand and he wiped the side of his face with the back of his wrist. The gesture was measured and clean, and he did not look away from her while he did it. And then he said, in Voss, and this I caught, because he spoke clearly and with the care of someone who wants to be precisely understood, he said, "Lady, there is a threat. We need to move now." She didn't move. I think she thought, in that initial moment, that he was performing some kind of rebuke, that the statement was his way of reasserting himself after the Velthrine, some human equivalent of saving face. She looked at him the way a person looks at something they don't believe. He said it again, same words, same tone. But his eyes had moved now, they were tracking left, toward the secondary entrance corridor, and there was something in the quality of that tracking that I recognized from watching him work, because I'd seen him scan a room 100 times and it never looked like this. This was not a scan. This was a lock. Marcus, Commander Yevaristan's voice came over the security channel. I was close enough to hear the subtle buzz of it from his comm piece. We have a signal anomaly in. He was already moving. He stepped around Lady Thesavin's right side, putting his body between her and the secondary entrance corridor. And in the same motion, he raised his left hand in the specific gesture that, in Joint Protection Corps protocol, means all personnel. Principal is at risk, close formation. 3 other security officers in the room responded immediately. They moved the way people move when they've trained for something long enough that the training and the doing are the same thing. Lady Thesavin still hadn't moved. I don't know if she was frozen or choosing to hold her position. I was frozen, I can say that much. The only reason I didn't drop the datapad was because my fingers had locked around it. Then the secondary entrance corridor's blast shielding, a passive security system, sensors triggered, not manually operated, dropped. The sound it made was like a very polite statement of emergency. A deep, resonant thunk that everyone in the room felt in their chest more than heard with their ears. A sound you don't need to be briefed on to understand. And then the overhead lighting shifted from reception warm to emergency gold, and every human in the room who had any security training moved toward cover, and every Voss in the room froze in place. And Marcus Hale stood directly between Lady Thesavin Oral Voss and the corridor where the threat was. He stood there with his sidearm drawn and his feet planted and his back straight, and his face was completely, absolutely, entirely calm. I'm going to tell you what had happened in the secondary entrance corridor, because you need to know it to understand the next part. The Third Conclave had attracted attention from a faction that our intelligence services called the Accord Severance Group, a multi-species extremist movement that opposed the ongoing diplomatic process between human and Voss territories. Not because they wanted war exactly, but because they wanted separation, total withdrawal, a hard border, no contact, no commerce, no negotiation. They'd been flagged as a potential threat 6 months earlier, and the security plan for the reception included elevated monitoring of all entry vectors as a result. What our intelligence hadn't anticipated, and this is the part that keeps security directors awake at night, I imagine, is that the group had gotten someone onto the station's maintenance crew 2 weeks before the reception. Not a team. One person who had spent 2 weeks doing their job almost perfectly, learning the station's secondary systems, and quietly, carefully, repositioning a very specific piece of equipment. The equipment in question was a focused resonance emitter, a device designed in its legitimate commercial form for deep structural scanning of construction materials. Used in very specific configurations, it could also create a targeted disruption pulse that would, in a room full of Voss physiological profiles, cause significant neurological distress. Not lethal, not immediately, but incapacitating, disorienting. Enough to disrupt a diplomatic reception in a way that would be very difficult to attribute cleanly, and would create precisely the kind of instability the group wanted to generate. The anomaly signal that Commander Aston had caught, a variation in the station's electromagnetic environment that didn't match any logged system activity, had been the emitter powering up. Marcus had detected the same thing before the commander had called it in, not through a comm signal, through something older and less technological. I asked him about this later, and he was quiet for a moment before he answered. He said the air changed, right by that corridor. There's a feeling in the air before something goes wrong, not something you can measure, you know it. 12 years of standing in rooms where something might go wrong. 12 years of learning the shape of normal so that not normal registers before your brain has caught up with what it's registering. He'd felt it before the sensors did. That's the only way I can explain the timing. What happened in the secondary corridor took about 6 minutes. 2 security officers responding to the blast shield drop found and disabled the Accord Severance operative before the emitter reached full output. There was a confrontation. No shots fired. The operative had a concealed weapon but never had the chance to draw it. 1 officer sustained a minor contusion injury. The operative was secured. The emitter was shut down by Commander Astan's team in the station's systems control center approximately 90 seconds after it had started powering up. They estimated, based on its configuration, that another 4 minutes would have brought it to effective range. 4 minutes. Marcus had moved approximately 90 seconds before the blast shields dropped. He'd had nearly 5.5 minutes on the margin. 5.5 minutes that he'd bought by noticing something in the air that no sensor had caught yet. When Commander Astan's voice came back over the security channel 6 minutes after the blast shields had dropped, she said, calmly and with the particular professionalism of someone who has just had a very long 6 minutes, "Threat neutralized. Station is secure. Secondary corridor is clear." The blast shields lifted. The emergency gold lighting shifted back toward reception warm. And the consensus ring, which had been completely, deeply silent for 6 minutes, started breathing again. Lady Thesivin Oral Voss had not moved. I want to be clear about this. She had stood for 6 minutes exactly where Marcus had left her when he stepped around to cover the corridor. Her staff were around her. They'd closed in as the situation escalated, but she herself had not moved. Not from paralysis, I don't think. Not from fear, though I'm sure the fear was there because she's a person and persons feel fear. But there was something else in her stillness that I recognized, because I'd seen it in her briefing file, in the accounting of how she'd conducted herself during the Drellin border skirmishes when there had been, on 2 occasions, active threat to the negotiating party she was part of. She processes by becoming still. And she was processing. Marcus turned from his position facing the corridor. He turned slowly, without the urgency of the previous 6 minutes, and he looked at Lady Thesivin, and he lowered his sidearm. He didn't say anything. The room was still figuring out whether it was allowed to move again. People were exchanging looks. The human diplomatic staff, the Voss delegation members, the Drithari observers, who had spent the 6 minutes in a kind of watchful crouch that I can only describe as alertness made physical. Lady Thesivin looked at Marcus for a long moment. Then she looked at the side of his face, the side she'd spat on. He'd wiped it with the back of his wrist. There would still be, I don't know how to say this without sounding clinical, evidence of the gesture on his face, on his wrist. She looked at it, and her expression did something complicated. I've tried to describe this to people who weren't there, and I'm not sure I've ever succeeded. The Voss physiognomic structure is different from human faces. The emotional readings don't translate directly. But something happened in her face. Something that was, in my read of it, very much like the feeling of a person who has just dropped something important from a height and is standing very still in the aftermath of hearing it hit the floor. She looked at the side of his face, and then she said something in Voss that even my functional comprehension couldn't fully parse, because the register she used wasn't diplomatic or formal or social. It was something older. Something that, when I asked the translation specialist about it afterward, she told me was a formalized verbal acknowledgement used in Voss culture exclusively in one context. The acknowledgement given to someone who has demonstrated that your assessment of them was wrong. Not an apology. The Voss don't have a direct cultural equivalent of apology the way humans mean it. What they have instead is this formalized recognition. An acknowledgement that says, I assessed incorrectly. I am correcting my assessment. This is on record. It's considered in Voss culture one of the weightier things a person of high standing can say, because it costs them something. It costs them the position of being right. Marcus listened to it. He understood it clearly. He gave no indication of confusion, which told me his Voss was better than I'd assumed. He was quiet for a moment after she finished. And then he said in English, not Voss, and he said it quietly enough that I almost didn't catch it across 40 feet of stilled air. I know, my lady. We can address that later. Right now we should get you to a secured room. She nodded, and she walked where he indicated. The aftermath. The reception was formally suspended. The Voss delegation was escorted to secured quarters in the station's diplomatic residential sector. The human diplomatic team went into an emergency session. The station went to elevated security protocols for the next 18 hours. I spent most of those 18 hours in the logistics support room, handling the cascade of communication and documentation that a security incident at a diplomatic function generates. It's a lot. The paperwork alone for a disrupted conclave session involves about 40 different reporting requirements across 8 different organizational frameworks. I kept thinking about what I'd seen. The Velthrine, the wiping of his face. The 5.5 minutes of margin he'd bought with 12 years of knowing what normal air feels like. I kept thinking about the expression on Lady Thesavin's face when she looked at the side of his face and said what she said. I talked to Commander Istan around hour 12. She was understandably focused on the security debrief, but she gave me a few minutes because I needed her to confirm something for my incident report. I asked her about Marcus's response time. She looked at me for a moment. She has that thing where she can look at a person and very precisely indicate that she is deciding how much to tell them. And then she said, "He called it in 7 seconds before my sensors picked it up." 7 seconds. Is that unusual? I asked because I needed to hear someone else say it. For most people, she said, yes. She paused. For Marcus, no. Then she went back to her debrief, and I went back to my documentation, and I thought about 7 seconds for a long time. 3 days after the incident, the third conclave resumed in a secondary venue. A different room with a higher security configuration, additional monitoring, and an expanded protection detail. Marcus Hale was still on the detail. I heard from one of the Voss delegation support staff, a young official named Thren who spoke excellent English and had become something of an informal liaison between the two teams, that Lady Thesavin had specifically requested he remain. Not asked, requested, which in Voss diplomatic language is a formal expression of preference that carries actual weight in assignment decisions. When I heard this, I thought about the acknowledgement she'd made, and I thought about what it had cost her to make it, and I thought about what it said about her that she had made it anyway. I thought about Marcus, too, standing at his position, outside the new venue, doing exactly the same job he'd been doing before. I walked past him on my way to the morning briefing. I almost didn't stop. I had a lot going on, but something made me pause. "Sergeant," I said. He looked at me. That same quality of attention, not pointed, not searching, just present. "How are you doing?" I asked. It was a simple question, the kind of question that usually gets a simple answer. Fine, good, keeping busy, the kind of answer people give when they don't expect you to actually want to know. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Doing my job." He said it without any particular emphasis, not defensive, not performative, just a statement of fact delivered by a person who is genuinely okay with the fact being simple. I nodded and walked to my briefing. But I turned it over in my mind for a long time afterward, because something about the plainness of it struck me. The absence of the thing most people would put there, the drama, the edge, the "can you believe what I went through" that would be completely understandable after what he'd experienced. Doing my job. 3 words, the whole thing reduced to 3 words. The Velthrine and the 6 minutes and the operative in the corridor, and the acknowledgement from a Voss noble that had probably never been given to a human protection officer in the history of Voss diplomatic engagement. Doing my job. The part I think about most. I've told this story a few times. Not many, it's not the kind of story that fits into casual conversation, and most of the people I'd want to tell it to either already know it or have their own version of it from other viewpoints in that room. But the question I always get when I do tell it is some version of, how did he not react? When she did that, how did he just stand there? And I never know quite how to answer, because I think the question is built on a premise that I'm not sure I agree with. I think the question assumes that not reacting means not feeling, that the stillness is evidence of emptiness. But I watched Marcus Hale for the 18 months I was on Meridian Drift Station, after the incident and up until my reassignment. I watched him in briefings and in corridors and in the small, unglamorous moments of doing a job that is mostly made of waiting for something to happen while hoping it doesn't. And what I came to understand, slowly, over those months, is that his stillness was not the absence of something. It was the presence of something that most of us spend our whole lives trying to find and never quite manage. It was the knowledge, settled and deep, and not requiring constant reaffirmation, of exactly who he was and why he was there. He knew what his job was, not just technically, not just procedurally. He knew in the way that some people know things that other people only think about, what it meant to stand between someone and harm, what it cost, what it required. And he had made peace with all of it, including the parts that weren't fair, including the parts that required him to receive things no person should have to receive and stay standing anyway. That's not emptiness, that's the opposite of emptiness. I don't know if Lady Thessalon understood that exactly, but I think her acknowledgement was, in its way, the beginning of understanding it. The recognition that she had assessed a person and found the assessment was wrong, and that the thing she'd assessed so wrongly was something she didn't have a category for. Because in Voss culture, from what I understand, a protection officer is a function, a professional necessity, valued for capability, not for the quality of the person behind it. And Marcus Hale was, in every way that mattered, irreducibly a person. The conclave concluded successfully 11 days later. The preliminary framework for what would become the Meridian Trade Protocols was initialed by both parties. It was, by the accounts I read afterward, a significant moment, the kind of diplomatic achievement that doesn't get called historic until years later, when the full shape of what it started becomes clear. I moved on from Meridian Drift Station to a posting in the Drithari Outer Reaches. Marcus, as far as I heard through the informal networks that diplomatic corps people maintain, went on to a senior protection role with the expanded Joint Protection Corps mission in the Voss Reach territories. The same territories where Lady Thessalon continued to serve as one of the most prominent diplomatic figures in the region. I don't know if they were ever in the same room again. I hope so somehow. Not for drama, not for resolution. Just because I think there's something worth honoring about two people who encountered each other at a difficult angle and both came out of it knowing something they hadn't known before. Thren, the young Voss official who'd become my informal liaison, messaged me about 4 months after I left the station. His language is very formal in written form, and it took me a moment to understand what he was saying, but when I did, I sat with it for a while. He said that Lady Thessalon had, in a formal address to the Voss Diplomatic Corps, mentioned the incident at the Third Conclave. Not in detail. Voss formal communication doesn't use detail the way human communication does. She had referenced it obliquely, in the context of a broader statement about the nature of service and the error of conflating rank with worth. And she had used a phrase, Thren said, that was old enough to be considered almost archaic in modern Voss diplomatic speech. A phrase that, in translation, means something like, "The one who stands between you and the dark does not need your recognition to continue standing." I read that a few times. I thought about the side of Marcus's face, the back of his wrist, the 7 seconds, the 5.5 minutes on the margin. The 3 words, "doing my job." And I thought about how much it costs to stand in the dark for someone who doesn't know you're there. And how the best ones do it anyway. Ending line. The stars outside the station's observation panels don't care about Velthrine or protocols, or the weight of a noble's acknowledgement. They just keep burning, and somewhere between them, people like Marcus Hale keep standing in the dark, watching for the thing nobody else has noticed yet. That's not a job, that's a calling, and some people answer it so quietly you almost miss it. Almost,